Hey, it's Jessie from squeegeeandink, and in this course I'm going to demonstrate how to expose screens with photosensitive emulsion and film positives. I'm also going to help you determine your own personal exposure times and walk you through any troubleshooting you might have when it comes to exposing screens. In this course we'll cover preparing your artwork for exposure, coating and drying your screens, the method of exposing screens with photosensitive emulsion, exposure unit types, how to find your exposure time, washing out your design, how to know if your exposure is perfect, and lastly, troubleshooting poorly exposed screens. When taking this course, you have full access to our exposure calculator, which you can print at home and helps you determine your own exposure times. By the end of this course, you'll have all the knowledge you need to get screen printing and have perfectly exposed screens. A good quality exposure starts with quality films, and they need to be 100% black, and not only black, but they need to be opaque. They need to stop the light from reaching the photosensitive emulsion. So even though these two are black, there's only one of these that's actually going to work as a good exposure for screen printing. The first positive I have here is printed with black ink, but there's not enough deposit of the black ink to be able to block the light. An easy way for you to see whether your positives are strong enough is if you were to hold your hand behind them, you can see the profile of your hand moving behind them. So the light is still getting through and your hand is casting a shadow through there. So that's just an easy indication to see that it's not very good. Whereas this one, I can move my hand behind it and I can't see it at all. So this one is very likely to be strong enough to block the light from reaching the screen during the exposure. In order to obtain this nice rich film positive, I'm using an inkjet Epson printer. I'm also using an all black ink system. So by that I mean, technically this has 5 different ink cartridges and normally they'd be used for CMYK, lots of different colours. However, I've filled all my ink cartridges up with black ink so that I'm just laying black over black and it's really dense. I'm also using something called AccuRIP software. So this is in between the computer and the printer, and it just tells the printer how much ink to deposit onto the film so that it's very dense, and I can manipulate halftones and how black and how much ink is being deposited on my film so I can get the richest, most dense positive possible. Let's jump onto the computer to show you what I mean by that. Using Adobe Illustrator to output my films. So on this I have my blind maggot logo, and the first thing I need to check before I output my films is that the color mode of the document is CMYK. So I can check that by pressing File, going down to Document Color Mode and making sure CMYK color is checked. That just means that it's going to output as CMYK printing and it's going to be ideal for our film positive. The next thing I need to check is that this is actually pure black and not just a very dark grey. So I can do that by selecting a part of the image, going up and pressing Select, Same, Fill Colour and Stroke, and hopefully it selects all of your image with the same black. Then I can double check in this little swatch here, this little fill swatch, and that will bring up my colour picker. And that'll identify the colour that's in the image at the moment. So it is all the zeros at the moment in this little hex box, which is perfect. Often you'll get it where it looks very dark and it looks it looks very black, but it is in fact actually just a dark grey, and that would be a combination of letters and numbers in the hex box. So we just want to drag that all the way down on the colour picker, right the way to all the zeros, and press OK to make sure that it's going to be a very opaque black when printed. We can also check the size of the positive at this point, but it all looks very good and ready to output. I'm actually going to be using a AccuRIP software in between the computer and the printer, and that just gives me the options to deposit more ink. It also allows me to apply halftones if needed, but in this occasion I just wanted to print a solid black colour. So I can press Command P or print, and you can just see here that the printer is running through the AccuRIP and then onto my Epson inkjet. I'm ready to press print and output my film. In order to get a good exposure on your screens, it's important to degrease and have your screens 100% dry before coating. We're using a dual cure emulsion, and it happens to be the AccuRIP Z1. This has a diazo mixture which we mix up with distilled water and we add to the emulsion to make it sensitized. We like to use this one because it's resistant against lots of different inks, but you can choose an emulsion that's right for your setup when asking your supplier which emulsion to get for you. It's important for everyone to have a good scoop coater, and this is the best one we've tried. It's called the Pro Angle, and the reason it's good is because it's got these extended lips here which pick up any of the extra beading along the edge of your coat. That just means your screens dry quicker and that the application of the emulsion on the mesh is very nice and smooth. We like to coat our screens once on each side and to dry them nice and flat. That just means that the emulsion encapsulates the mesh and it always gives us a really good, clean, level exposure that we can trust. Another important thing when it comes to drying your screens after they've been coated is that the screen lies flat, and by that I mean with the print side down in a rack, and try and let it dry as long as possible. When you're drying your screen after it's been coated with emulsion, it's important to leave it in a dark room. When the emulsion is dry, and by dry I just mean touch dry, but typically you could leave it overnight just to make sure, now it's ready to expose. So what happens to photosensitive emulsion is, when it comes into contact with UV light, it undergoes a chemical reaction, it creates some more bonds and it becomes hardened. Any of the photosensitive emulsion that doesn't come into contact with UV light is still water soluble and you'll be able to rinse it away. So the objective of exposing a screen with a film positive is to block light from reaching certain parts of the coated screen and then leave some areas so that light can reach them and they can harden. So in this case, we want the light to be blocked away from the black of the image in this film positive so that we can rinse out that unsensitized emulsion. Then once it's all nice and dry again, we'll be able to pass ink through the open mesh, and the ink won't be able to get through the blocked mesh where the emulsion has hardened. So in our setup we have a metal halide bulb, and our exposure unit is very large. Obviously you don't need one just like this, but the fundamentals of all exposure units are very similar. So what you're going to find is you've got a light source, then you've got maybe a piece of glass just to hold the film and the screen on. And the film is going to be blocking out the light. So it goes light source, glass, film, and then you can do the flat side of your screen. And in lots of cases you're going to find some kind of exposure blanket or piece of foam holding all those things in close contact with each other. The reason for having something weighted on top is to keep it nice and close so that the light doesn't get around and bend around your lines and make your line work appear kind of like shady or ghosted. So we want a nice close contact. So we're going to put our exposure blanket down, and we're actually going to put a vacuum on, which again helps the emulsion and really come close towards the film and the glass. In this course we're using our exposure unit which has a metal halide bulb. However, there's lots of different types of methods and exposure units that you can use to expose your screens. So here are 5 of the top most frequently used methods of exposure. The top one and the most effective in our opinion is the metal halide bulb exposure unit. That's because the bulb emits a very rich source of UV. However, these units are often very large and not accessible to many people. The second method is LED little bulbs in an exposure unit. That's a great method because it's very easy to run, very energy efficient. However, the light is coming from lots of different angles, so you might experience some undercutting, but in most studios that's not something that you're really going to notice on the screens. So you find LED exposure units in lots of professional studios. A cheaper, more accessible version of the LED exposure unit is number 3, and that's the fluorescent tubes exposure unit. The good thing about these is they often come in quite a compact size to expose screens for t-shirt printing especially, and they often have a vacuum blanket to hold your screen in place. There are issues with them because the light is being emitted from lots of different tubes, and the tubes can degrade and you can have dark patches in your screens. However, it's still an effective way to expose your screens. In 4th place, we've got the overhanging lamp. So lots of people getting into screen printing will use a lamp which is suspended over the screen. The problems with that might be that you actually can't expose huge screens because the light can only go so far and actually make the chemical reaction on the screen. The benefits are that those types of overhanging lamps are very cheap, and they do technically output some UV light, but it's not very rich, so you're going to have to dial in your exposure times to a very, very fine amount of time. And lastly, we've got the sun. So we don't recommend using the sun as an exposure method, and that's just because it's so variable as to how much time you're going to have to leave your screen out in the sun. So we probably don't advise that for professional setups, or even really having any consistency in your exposure times. You're going to find that your exposure time is probably different to somebody else's. This is because everyone's got different variables in their setup. So these variables might be the strength of their bulb, the mesh on the screen, the emulsion they're using, and lots of other different things. So we all have to find out our own exposure times independently of each other. So there's 2 main methods to finding out your exposure time. The first being trial and error, which might take quite a long time and lots of screens, and I'm going to show you the results of trial and error exposing later in the video. And the second one is more efficient, and that's by using an exposure calculator. You can print your own file of this at home, and as long as you're using 100% dense inkjet ink onto acetate film, you'll be able to produce your own exposure calculator. I'm going to run through how to use the exposure calculator now. When we're using the exposure calculator, what we're basically doing is doing 10 mini exposures and then working back to see which one worked the best. So the way we can use it is we can follow some of the maths at the bottom, and it's all explained on how to do that. And then we can attach the exposure calculator to the flat side of our screen with the ink facing down. And I'm just going to tape it to the emulsion. This is because I don't want it to shift as I'm blocking the light from reaching that part of the emulsion. Now the exposure calculator is securely in place, I can flip it around. And then what I'm trying to do is block the light from reaching certain parts of the calculator in steps. So I have this handy bit of black Teflon, but you could use some black card or something that's very opaque and is going to block the light from reaching certain parts of the screen. Then what we're going to do is we're going to hold the screen and block the light from reaching most of the screen apart from the first section. So that's labelled number 1, and it's this whole row. We're going to expose that to light according to what you worked out in the little bit of maths at the bottom of the exposure calculator, And then when that exposure is done, we're going to move the black along a channel to reveal the second column. We're going to expose that to light and just keep doing that process all the way along. So then we're going to expose it to number 3, all the way down to number 10, when at last you've got the whole screen exposed to light for a short period of time. Then we're ready to wash it out and determine what is the best and most ideal amount of time to expose our screens for. When you're looking at the results from your exposure calculator, what you're trying to look out for is the zone on the calculator that is the clearest and has the finest detail exposed onto the screen. So in our case, we're actually looking at number 8 in this channel. Typically it lies around 5 or 6. So we now know that with this particular mesh type being a yellow 7070 mesh, that if we did it for a minute and a half, then we'd get a good clean exposure on this particular combination. So again, it's very important to do your own tests, and there are going to be variations between lower meshes and higher meshes, and even between yellow and white meshes. Another thing to note is that we've got a metal halide bulb, and that is actually something that takes a little while to heat up and get going, so they will also change our results. So again, you can't take our results at face value. I'm just trying to illustrate the kind of results and technique that you can use to hone in your own exposure times. So now I've determined what my exposure time is, I'm ready to go ahead and expose my real screen. For best results when you're washing out your screen, it's good to use a power washer, and what we do is we lightly mist this inside of the screen first, and then we do the same on the other side, just to wet them and let the loosened unexposed emulsion start falling away from the mesh. And then once it's had about 30 seconds to loosen up, then we go and spray it with the power washer to fully clear out all the unexposed emulsion. Another method of letting the screen soak, which can be quite handy when you've got lots of screens to wash out, is to leave the screen in a dip tank but full of just water. That way the emulsion can soak off, and then you can very quickly spray out any excess that's still in the mesh. It's also important to wash your screen out properly from the flat side, because this is the side where the emulsion is mainly set once you've dried it, so it's actually present on this side of the screen, so it's stronger and can take some of that pressure. So I'm really happy with the results, and it washed out really nicely, so I'm going to dry this screen off and get it into production. I have gone ahead and exposed 2 more screens, and that is to show you the difference between an underexposed screen and an overexposed screen. The first screen here is an underexposed screen, so I'm going to wash it out and talk you through how you can determine if your screen is underexposed too. There are 2 quite subtle things about this screen that show to me that this screen is underexposed. The first thing that I can see really quite plainly is the fact that I can see all the film outline around the image. So in like a rectangle where the film was printed, I can see that impression on the screen. That's like a really quick indicator that the screen is underexposed. And the second thing is, if I turn the screen around, there's a sliminess to it. So if I touch this bit, you can almost see there's undercured emulsion in kind of like a film, and you can feel it on your hands as well. It's not just wet like certain areas. There's like a film of underexposed emulsion which is just going to leak into the open mesh areas when I'm drying it. That will give partial blockages and will probably break down on press as well. So even though on first impressions it doesn't look too bad and I got the whole outline of the image, those 2 things are going to affect us when we're in production. This second screen is overexposed, so we have like cranked up the exposure time, and it's also got a weak positive so that all the light is getting through prematurely. So at the moment I can see a faint impression, but I'll wash it out and show you what to look out for with an overexposed screen. This is a really good example of an overexposed screen. As you can see, the emulsion didn't just fall out like with a well-exposed screen, and that means that the UV light has got through the film positives where we're trying to block the image out. It's got through there, and then it's started exposing and hardening the emulsion underneath. So even though I can see the faintest impression, I actually had to use the force of the power washer really quite close for a while. I'll show you this. And that open mesh there is the result of me putting a lot of force on that emulsion. And you can see that the line edge has kind of all crumbled off because I was putting so much pressure on the emulsion as well. That would take me probably about 3 or 4 minutes at full pressure to get it out, and the lines are never going to be nice and slick how they're intended. So that's a really good example of an overexposed screen where the film positive especially wasn't strong enough to block the light from reaching the design. There are lots of reasons why your screen may not be exposing very well. We see lots of common issues happen in the industry, so I'm just going to run through a couple of the most common problems and issues. The most common problem with exposures is weak transparencies. So the effect on the screen can look like even sliminess of the emulsion. It can look like you've got an impression of the image, but then when you go to wash it out, it's very difficult to wash out. It doesn't just fall off after 30 seconds. You might find that the line edge is jagged. There's lots and lots of different horrible effects that can have on your screen. So the only way around that is to maintain a nice thick deposit of ink on your film positives, and it might even be the case that in the initial stages of getting up and running that you get your film positives printed by a professional. The next most common problem is image ghosting. So that might mean that your image looks like it's all there, but actually there's like a faint haziness around it, or a doubling up of your image. This can happen because some people put 2 of their weak transparencies stuck together to try and make the effect of a very strong transparency. And it might be the case that the light isn't quite like they're not lined up perfectly, so then it causes the impression of ghosting. There's other reasons as well. So even if you have a nice dense film positive and you don't have really close contact between the glass, the film and the screen, then the light can actually undercut the film positive and kind of like make a blurry edge to your design. So the way to fix that particular issue is to have dense film positives and have very close contact between the film screen and the glass. So some people weight it down, and in my case I use a vacuum blanket to keep the contact nice and close. Another common problem is uneven exposures. So you might even find that half your screen is exposing well and the other half has issues. So troubleshooting for that would involve making sure that the coat of emulsion is nice and even. So by that I mean having an even pressure when you're coating, and maybe coating just one time on each side of the screen. You might also need to make sure you have a high tension mesh on your screen, so to avoid like handmade screens and stapled screens, so the mesh isn't all wobbly. And there's also some other things that you can look out for on your exposure unit. So you might have an exposure unit with lots of different lights, and one of those lights might be broken, or it might be dulling, and you've got like dead patches in your exposure. So check your light sources, have your coat of emulsion nice and even, and have your mesh tight on your screen, and that should mean that you're getting even, consistent exposures. You might also have a problem where your fine details like halftones and very fine lines aren't coming out. This may just be that your mesh count isn't high enough to achieve that type of detail. So you just need to up your mesh count, because the finer the mesh, the more detail that screen can hold. Emulsion breaking down on the press is one of the most annoying consequences of a poorly exposed screen. This can happen because your emulsion isn't suited to the ink that you're using. So some are designed specifically for water-based ink, some are designed for plastisol. So that's the first thing to check. Second thing is it's very likely that your screen is underexposed, and any moisture getting into the screen at this point is then having the consequence of breaking it down further and moving around any uncured emulsion. Another reason why your screen might break down on press is because the emulsion wasn't dry enough when you exposed it. So there's a really easy solution for that. Just let your screens dry, maybe overnight, in a nice warm, not humid environment, and that will allow your emulsion to really dry out and get a really good clean exposure. Finally, a very common thing is pinholes. So these are little dots in the finished exposure. So you can really easily rectify that by having a degrease of your screen before you come to coat it. So you use a degreaser, rinse it off, dry it, and then you can coat your screen. That will get rid of most of your pinholes. And then one other thing to look out for is little dots of dust and dirt on your actual glass on your exposure unit. So every day, or just before you're about to expose some screens, clean your glass with some glass cleaner and a rag, and that will eliminate that issue for you when you come to printing. One more way to avoid pinholes is to dry them in a dust-free environment. So we do that in our own studio by hoovering the exposure room frequently, and also if you're aiming a fan directly at your screens, you might be blowing up dust that you can't even see is there into the wet emulsion and just leaving it in the wet emulsion. So you can dry your screens, but just try and put the fan heater pointing away from the screens so that it's not blowing that dust directly into the screens. Thank you so much for watching this course. I really hope you found it useful, and I really want to see how your exposures came out as a result of watching it. So things to think about with your project are how long you exposed your screen for, what kind of emulsions did you end up using, and what kind of setup do you have to expose your screens. Screen exposures can be tricky, but once you've mastered this, you're going to be a much better printer and more consistent, and you're probably going to have a better time. There's lots of variables with screen exposure, so please ask in the comments any queries that you have along this process, and I'm sure we'll be able to help you and point you in the right direction to get your exposures looking perfect every single time.